I actually have been involved with Salon since the very beginning. I put together its initial seed funding when it was founded in 1995. It is the oldest new media company on the planet, which says a lot of things, by the way, some of which I'll touch on. But stayed close over the years, and then in the last few years, I've been one of those who's been particularly fascinated with the disruption going on in news, and felt that Salon was a great brand and highly worthwhile of an effort to see if we can't transform it into something larger. But it is a challenging environment. I mean, these are, in many cases, these are the best of times and the worst of times. And in periods of disruption, that all depends on what side of the equation you're on. It's the best of times if you're a disruptor. It's the worst of times if you're a disruptee. I, for one, however, do feel that when it comes to the future of news, that the future of news will be far, far better than its past. That's a hard thing to say today, or a hard thing for many people to hear today, when we see the degree of damage and retrenchment, and maybe a polite word to call it, with traditional media properties. Why do I feel that way? It really comes down to, in a sense, math. It comes down to this. We're basically moving from a world of news media that had its basis in monopolies, which is really what metropolitan newspapers have been for about 40 years. And by the way, I think often in these discussions we sort of lose sight of the fact that the newspaper business was always a very competitive and not necessarily profitable business until about 1960. Interestingly, that came about when TV forced major cities to go from being 5, 4, 3 newspaper towns down to 1 and sometimes 2 newspaper towns under a joint operating agreement. And then they had 3.5 decades of monopolistic profitability. Great period to be in if you were part of that, but it was really fairly atypical if you want to look at the history of the news business. Now we have a world, and my reason for optimism is simply this, is, with the internet in the last 15 years, we've effectively put a printing press in everyone's home, right? And that has to have a big effect, and it is having a big effect. We've got more people creating content and sharing content in the history of the world. Obviously, there's a typical wheat to chaff ratio. A lot of it isn't maybe worth our own personal attention, but it's happening out there. People have the access, they can share, they can communicate. Is that a replacement for investigative journalism coming from established entities? Not entirely. But I do feel that, again, statistically, over time, good and interesting things will happen from that. And let's take a look at that math, in a sense, that statistical math. One of the things in the last few years I'm usually the one on the panels who kind of makes some people angry. One of the things that I find fault with over the last few years is the degree of romanticization of how effective newspapers have been, even during that great and successful period of the last 40 years. And people come out and say, gosh, if it wasn't for newspapers, democracy would fail. If it wasn't for newspapers and all of that investigative journalism and city hall reporting they did, where is that all going to come from? And frankly, a lot of it is, I've always been on the other side of the equation saying, gee, my newspaper really isn't serving my community terribly well. Successful business. But when I look at, for instance, the Boston Globe during its heyday, how many investigative journalists did the Boston Globe have on its staff? 3, 4? Not very many. Again, I'm not saying there wasn't a lot of good stuff there, but we've sort of blown out of proportion, and in many regards, just how much these institutions actually gave back in terms of true, difficult enterprise journalism. They did some, but only some. And so when I look at that from a statistical perspective and now see how many people have access to the web, access as a publishing medium, as it were, in say, Boston. So you had 4 or 5 investigative journalists, and now we have anyone in the Boston area who has an interest in a subject who can actually surface and do enterprising things, will happen. In fact, what I often cite as, in a sense, the prototypical blogger was I.F. Stone. Someone who I met early on in my career, and if you don't know about I.F. Stone, you should look him up, but he was one of the original muckrakers. Because muckraking always came actually outside of the traditional media. Because the traditional media, mainstream media, typically get beholden to larger interests. There are places they don't want to go. And so often the big breaking stories, the innovative efforts into big subjects came from outside the mainstream. So I.F. Stone would dig something up in Washington, and the mainstream would ultimately pick it up in many cases, but it took somebody on the outside, on the fringes, to actually get there. It's that makes me feel confident about the future. However, between now and then, there's, again, tremendous amount of disruption, tremendous amount of pain, and it's not easy to deal with. It's a very different world if you're a news media property as we are today. It's not like just people coming to your website. You got people coming through search engines, people coming through the social layer, through Facebook and the like. These are both opportunities and challenges as you look to build audiences and build a sustainable property. How does one embrace disruption in these environments? Well, the approach that we're taking, and again, we've achieved some progress in the last year. I'm not going to say this is a case study in great success. We're still not profitable. The last few years, particularly with the economy, are very difficult. But the process that we've been taking is basically to try as hard as we can to rethink everything. Rethink everything that we do and how we do it. We, in the last year, have completely redesigned the website with great thoughtfulness towards the fact that it's not just about people who come to us, but it is about making sure that the content that we create is properly positioned such that when someone executes a search on Google, maybe they'll find our stuff. That's a good thing. How do we again, best take advantage of the social fabric with Facebook? How do we change the form of content? Fact is, one thing we have changed is the average length of our articles is shorter. Because we find, frankly, that's, I did some research 2 years ago and found that any article that was longer than 1,500 words, only about 25% of the people finished the article. That says something, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Yes, only 25% finished the article. That says something to me about us needing to reconsider the form. As an industry, I think we all need to reconsider the form. It's very easy to be comfortable in our boxes. In fact, one point I'd like to make on that is you cannot be a news media entity in a world of technology and ongoing change without constantly rethinking what you do, without constantly rethinking the product that you put out. And why is that hard for existing media companies today, for traditional media players? Because they've never had to do it. I don't say that in a critical way. They've just never had to do it. When you think about it, the form and function of a newspaper hasn't changed in 100 years, right? It still leaves a paper. The added color and larger images and so on and so forth, but the basic capabilities of the media form did not change. Now, everything is changing all the time. And I may focus this year on social media, which I didn't even think about 4 years ago in this business. What am I going to be thinking about 3 or 4 years from now? We know it's going to be something else. So it's hard to be critical of those in traditional media for not thinking outside the box when the box was the same way for 100 years. So that's basically what we have been doing at Salon, is trying to figure out how do we, again, look at all these questions and change what we do. How do we define how we interact with our audience? How do we take advantage of our audience to help us build content, for that matter? But change is hard. Change is one of those things, and I remember one of the early discussions I had with the Salon team, everyone gets excited about change and says, yes, that's great, we have to do all those things. And it's all very nice and comfortable until it affects you individually in a way that's different from the terms you would have expected. So it's hard. This is not easy stuff for anyone. I do think the future of news is going to be far more chaotic, in a sense, than the media form of the past, where we had a very understood layer in the media space of large mainstream properties and very little else beyond that. We're going to be in an environment that is far more chaotic, with far more participants, and where the hard definition of the term journalist may not be the definition that will apply in many cases going forward. As I said, I'm optimistic, but there's a lot is going to happen between now and then, have to happen between now and then. At Salon, as a result of those changes, we've achieved some good progress. We redesigned the product. Our audience is now 25% larger than it was a year ago. We see double the traffic from search that we saw a year ago. All good things. Even our revenue is up, but it's not quite there. We have a lot more work to do. But again, I think to try to be successful in a new media environment, you have to constantly look at change, constantly ask yourselves the questions of why do I do it this way? Why might I not consider other opportunities and other options to doing it, such that you can keep up with the flow of change and hopefully stay at least in step, if not try to get one step ahead. I look forward to more discussion. Thank you.